Good evening. I'm Marjorie Mead, Interim Director of the Wade Center, and it's a joy to welcome all you this evening. This is a real treat to have someone who we just met today and has rapidly become a good friend of the Wade Center, Ross Wilson, here. And this, being able to facilitate and have this evening possible, just want to thank a few people. Tony Payne from the Conservatory, Sarah Miglio, Director of Core Curriculum Studies, and David Hooker of the Art Department. And you have a very special evening in store for you. We are going to be recording it this evening, so if you haven't already turned off your cell phone, we'd be grateful if you do so. And you'll be able to point people and also enjoy this again by looking at it online. So let me just introduce David, who's going to take over and introduce Ross to you. So thank you.
And that's my reminder to turn off my cell phones. Thank you for that. I'm very happy to see you all here, and I have the privilege of being able to introduce Ross to you. I wanted to give you a little bit of background. Ross is one of Northern Ireland's leading artists. He studied fine art at the University of Ulster and the Chelsea School of Art in London. London. Yes, Chelsea's London, yeah. He's also been a visiting speaker at Harvard and Oxford. He is I would say primarily known as a portrait artist, at least in terms of reputation, with many notable portraits, including Nobel Laureates Derek Wolcott and Seamus Heaney, as well as playwright Arthur Miller. He's also done some public sculpture work, which he'll be talking about today, including C.S. Lewis, so I know you're going to get to hear plenty about that. His artwork is displayed across the world and in several public and private institutions. So please welcome Ross.
It's a great privilege to be here tonight in the Wade Center, and I've wanted to be here for a long, long time, and finally made it. And I did speak to Marjorie, I'm sure it was about 10 years ago, about coming. So it's been a slow boat from China, but I eventually got here via Washington and Nashville, and tomorrow I head on to Toronto. So it's been a bit of a big journey for me, but it's been a really amazing journey, and it's been brilliant to meet David and Marjorie and Jerry and lots of other people and the students from David's course. I was very impressed by their focus and their dedication to the study of art. And I think that's something that Wheaton, especially the new facility in the gymnasium, will help bring another dimension to Wheaton's identity. And it's something I think that will fan out into the wider college. Creativity is a very important part of thought process, and I think in the education system in Britain and probably America, people are educated out of creativity, and that's not always a good thing. And we need to encourage our children to think and to see and to be creative. And they may not end up as great artists or writers or filmmakers, but they will have an appreciation for creativity. The first description we have of God in Scripture, in the first chapter of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, in the first verse, in the fourth and fifth word, is about a doing God. In the beginning, God created. And creativity is something that we're all interacting with every day, whether we know it or not. And that's part of God's DNA in us, part of what makes us who we are, helps us to see, helps us to search. And as I said, God is a doing God, a God who creates, and we are part of that creation. And those of us who know Christ are part of a recreation that He made for us through that doorway and that truth that is in Christ Jesus. I'd like to sort of start off. I'm going to come to Lewis in my talk, but I'm going to show a range of things. And John Ruskin talked about this idea of seeing with the soul of the eye. and not merely seeing through the lens of the eye. You know, we do that, but we truly see with the soul of the eye, and that's seeing beyond the ordinary. And in a way, you know, as people who are involved in the creative process, whether that's teaching, which is a very important part of the creative process, the teachers are helping to form minds and identities in young people and older people. And so it's a big responsibility, but seeing is really important. How we see things, how we translate things. Lewis saw himself as a person who saw things and who wanted to translate those things so ordinary people could understand them. And Ruskin said that we do not see through the lens of the eye, we see with the soul of the eye. So it's this idea about looking and seeing and truly seeing. We see lots of things, but we don't always recognize what they are. This is how my father saw me when I was a kid, on the bonnet of his Pride and Joy Volkswagen Beetle. And this is a really important photograph to me. It's caught in the flash of a shutter, and in the background is my mother, who's still with us. She's 84 and very youthful. And the man with my mother in that photograph is my great-grandfather. And I remember him taking me out for a walk when I was a little kid. He fought at the Battle of the Somme, and he sort of obviously survived it, but lots of his friends didn't. And the idea of just even holding his hand and remembering him taking me for walks, it wasn't just a few years ago that the centenary of the Somme was celebrated. So I'd held hands with a man who'd fought in a battle 100 years ago. And this link with history, this link with seeing and how he saw it, he never spoke about it. He was trapped in no man's land with his friends, many of them who were killed and wounded, and he had to wait the night time and crawl back to the friendly trenches. But he had an influence on my life. So this is how my father saw me. You know, this is how my father saw his first son. I had 3 brothers, but this is me being seen through my father's eyes. And until I became a father and had a daughter, I didn't know really how my father loved me. But I knew he loved me, but when I became a father myself, I realized what it was like to love as a father. And there's a parallel here with another father who loves us and how he sees us. So in that little shutter click, that memory was caught. And those really important people in my life who had an impact on me and continue to have an impact on me were caught in that moment of light. The piece of light that was trapped onto that film recorded that moment, which is really important to me. So it's about seeing and looking, and how we see as we change and go through life, when we become fathers, when we become grandfathers, when we see our first child born, or you know, those things have a big impact on how we see other things around us. And the idea of reaching out to others, and through our sight and through the connections we have with God, is a really important thing. These are some really amazing quotations. You can read them and take them in. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And we need to give others attention, and we need to pay attention to others around us, not just in the form of creativity, but in the form of listening and being and having empathy with others who are probably, you know, in many ways hurting. Lots of people hurt in many ways that we don't see, and we have a responsibility as those who have been created to look into others' lives and to get alongside them. I've learned a lot about that in the last few years, about friends who've become terminally ill, and just being with them has taught me a lot. I've seen a lot through things. And we must encourage each other as well. And one of my favourite stories is about an artist called Benjamin West, who, when he was 7 years old, this is back in the 1700s, he lived in rural Philadelphia, a place called Springfield. And his mum left him in charge of his new baby sister called Sally. She was just an infant. And Benjamin West was about 6, 7 years old. And for the first time in his life, he decided he would do a portrait. He'd never done that before. So he took his father's ink and he started to make a portrait of Sally. And he had ink over Sally, he had ink on her cot, ink on the floor, ink on himself. His mother came back to find him covered in ink, and he had this piece of paper behind his back. And he looked very, he was fearful that his mother was going to react in a very negative way. But his mother asked to see what was on the piece of paper, and she recognized that it was a portrait of his little sister. And she said, "Why, it's Sally." And she reached down and kissed him on the head. 20 years later, Benjamin West became portrait painter to George III. He became the second president of the Royal Academy in London. And he was often asked, "What made you a painter?" And he said, "My mother's kiss made me a painter." that moment of encouragement. We need to have it. In 1981, my mum went out to buy the Sunday papers and came back with a Bible. That's a really weird thing to do in the normal run of things, but she came back with a Bible and gave me a Bible. I was in my first year, I think, at university. And for some reason, she felt led to buy this Bible. My mum didn't go to church. She was out on a Sunday buying the Sunday papers and came back and gave me a Bible and reached down and kissed me. And that day, I didn't know a lot about the Bible then. I read Romans chapter 8. And it just, completely blew me away. And that night, I decided I should go to church because I felt something or someone was searching after me. And I went to church, and the minister who was preaching that night was preaching from Romans chapter 8. And that was like a really profound moment in my life. And Lewis had an experience like that as well when Flora, his mother, I think the week she died, called both him and Warren in and gave them a Bible each. And so that encouragement of God's word being put into your life is a really important thing and can affect you and can lead you into all kinds of different pathways with the truth and the purpose of God. This is another hero of mine. It's quite an important and profound statement about how we should journey and travel on, and how sometimes, we don't know where we are, but sometimes that's the beginning of our journey. And we should be searching every day about where we go, how we do it, in our work, in our life, in our family, how we react to other people. And I found Wendell Berry a very encouraging figure in terms of a poet. I like poets. They've had a big effect in my life, and they continue to do so. Each of us here tonight who have come to this talk have come on a different pathway. We've all had a different journey to this point in our life tonight. And that pathway sometimes can be a difficult one. It can be one that's purposed and guided. But I believe in many pathways in life that God is searching to help and guide and bring people to the place of the cross, the place where pathways truly begin in life. This is just a quick slide which probably encapsulates about 25 years of my life. And these are things I dreamt of when I was a student. And these are things that I was able to achieve in later life. And they were really important things at the time. And I wouldn't discourage someone from being ambitious and trying to get into, like collections and have your work shown in different places. But, I got past that. And so what's really important for me now as an artist is now, today, is how I live and how I survive as a painter or a sculptor. And I remember a friend was asked once, what was success? And he said, success for me is being able to survive at what I do. So I just show that to encourage some of the younger students that you're able to achieve many things in life. Don't be frightened, or the worst that anybody can say is no. So you need to keep going and persevering. This was a painting that really had a big impact on me when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I went to church, Sunday school. I was sent to Sunday school. And I used to hear the name Jesus being spoken. I didn't really know the detail of Jesus. I was just a little kid. But I remember seeing this painting in a book in my grandmother's house, and all of a sudden things became a bit clearer, and that was a long, long time ago. But this visual image of Christ on a cross helped me see, in the print, but also see this idea of someone who would give a part of himself up. And that was locked into my early life. And when I read that chapter of Romans, that sort of hit on that text. And I remembered that painting. I remember turning that page out of the book and taking it out with me and showing it to other friends, because it was like I'd found this image of the Jesus and what he did. And so visual things are very important, and visual things can impact us. What we see impacts us before what we hear people say. And so we need to be careful what we see and what we look at. And if we look and see at the right things, we can be guided and led into better and greater places. This is someone else who was a real hero to me. And at a point in my life, I was about 14, when I was becoming aware I had this ability to paint. And this is the young Vincent van Gogh. It's Van Gogh, okay? Jerry, not Van Gogh, okay? And he was really the father of modern art. And this is Vincent around age 14. I'm sure you probably know that he went on to be a missionary in Belgium in the Bornage, and he talked about reading Spurgeon's sermons. I think he heard D.L. Moody speak in Paris, and he preached his first sermon in Psalm 119 and talked about this idea of being reborn and born again and how important that was. He ended up in a mining area as a missionary, and he gave away most of his clothes and possessions, and he lived in quite squalid conditions. The oversight of the mining or the missionary society came to find him and were disappointed in how he looked and how he was dressed, and they cut his support off. And he stayed for one more year and almost starved to death, and then he walked away from the mission field. And many people will say at that point, hallelujah, because then he started to paint. He moved from the unpainted life into the painted life. And many of the things he painted were about ordinary people, people who worked the land, people he met, and similar people he would have met in his ministry. This is the first sculpture commission I did. I sort of talked myself into it at an interview. I'd never done a sculpture before in my life. And then when I got the commission, I was very frightened. And it was a company called Bass, who are brewers. They make beer. I didn't drink their product, but I found the process of working with them very sobering. This is made in wax first, and there's no foundries in the north of Ireland, so you have to travel to Dublin. And this was 1997, and there was still a border checkpoint between the north and the south, and there was police checkpoints. And I had to transport this figure down. I had an old Saab 900 hatchback, and I put the barrel in the back of the Saab hatchback, the legs in the back seat, and the upper part of the torso in the passenger seat with the seatbelt on, of course. Yeah, and it was winter time, and I thought I'll leave really early to go to Dublin. I'll leave at 5:30 in the morning. There'll be no police or army at that time in the morning, and I couldn't turn the heater on in the car because the figure was made of wax. And but he had a seatbelt on, so we're driving down towards the border, and there's about 2 other cars on the road at that time in the morning, and then I can't believe it. There's a police checkpoint, and they have a red torch, and I thought, they're not going to believe any kind of story I give them that why I'm out this time in the morning with a torso in the front seat, a pair of legs in the back seat, and a barrel in the hatchback. So I put the window down just a little bit, and the policeman shines his torch, and he says, "Where are you going?" I said, "We're going to Dublin." And he's showing the torch, and he says, "Away you go." And I thought, wow, from a security point, that's really frightening. But from an artistic point of view, I saw it as a compliment. And then I got over the border, and there was the southern police who are called the Garda, and they just waved at the both of us. So this was the first sculpture I did. I got my brother to sit in the barrel for about 2 weeks to model for it. And it was 1997, and I thought that would be the only sculpture I'd ever do. I didn't think there would ever be another one, or I would ever get to do another one. This is outside the Waterfront Concert Hall in Belfast. And those cranes are where the new law courts are now, and that was a big thing for me to be able to do that sculpture. And if I hadn't done that sculpture, I wouldn't have thought about the next sculpture I did, which was to do with C.S. Lewis. And this, helped sort of preempt that in one way, because I became very familiar with the process of making, and I'm still learning. I'm not an expert by any means. The older I get, the more I seem to realize I don't know as much as I should know, and I still need to learn a lot. But and the sculpture the Lewis sculpture came along through circumstance. It was timing. It was the centenary of his birth, and all that was going to happen. There was going to be a lecture in Queen's University, and a blue plaque unveiled at Dundela Flats, the site of where he was born, originally Dundela Villas. And at that time, I met a young guy who's become quite a successful hymn writer, a guy called Keith Getty, and we wanted to do something together. And we had to go and stay with Douglas Gresham, who I would sort of class as mildly eccentric. And we had to stay with Douglas down his house, and to try and sort of get past the C.S. Lewis estate so we could do these things. And it was in Douglas' house that I saw a letter that sort of changed everything. This is a beautiful quotation from Lewis about what God wants. He wants us. He doesn't want anything from us. All we can do is give ourselves to him, and then that changes everything. This is an important roadmap from Headington Quarry, the kilns, to Whipsnade Zoo, and it's about 40 miles. And it was on this journey on the 20th of September 1931 that Lewis had his conversion to Christianity in the sidecar of his brother Warnie's motorcycle. And he records that when he set out that morning there was a mist on the ground, a sort of fog, and that he didn't really know who Jesus Christ was. He had a conversion to theism before this, and they set out about 11:15 in the morning, and they got there before 1 o'clock, and they'd stopped halfway for beer. And halfway through the journey, the mist cleared, and Lewis says that when he got to the zoo up here, he was aware that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. So, between these 2 points, this great realization took place. The alphabet of grace spelt itself out clearly in Lewis's life, although Lewis said that the great angler had his hook in my mouth for years and was bringing him in. So this is the point where he was landed, as it were, into his faith in Christ. And it's a sort of interesting landscape of in one sense, of the soul, how Lewis was affected and what he was thinking about on this journey. I think the technical name for a motorcycle and sidecar is called a combination. And I often wonder about the combination in Lewis's mind and heart, the combination of grace, the combination of faith, and that realization who Christ was. This is a motorcycle and sidecar similar to the one that he travelled in. It would have been very noisy. It would have been very bumpy. It would have been a bit of a rickety journey. This is the brochure for Whipsnade Zoo, which opened earlier that year. I think the date's on it. Yeah, May 1931, and Lewis went there in September. And this is in the hill near Whipsnade Zoo, this land. And it wasn't there when Lewis went, but it's there now. I think it was put there just around the war years. And then Lewis records about Warnie talks about going into the zoo. Jack stayed outside and he lay down for a rest. He was looking after the dog, which had come with other friends in the car. And he talks about this idea of being aware, like a man being aware, a man in sleep being aware that he's becoming awake. That he's all of a sudden become awake, that he's come out of this sleep. And Warnie went into the zoo with the friends. They came out. And Warnie talked to him about this bird that he'd seen. And they actually mention it. And this is a photograph of the actual bird that they saw, Bultitude. Any questions about that, Jerry can answer those later. But I searched and found photographs of Whipsnade Zoo and the bird that was in the zoo. And they went back the following Monday to see the bird again. The bird had an effect on them. And these were the sort of things they were doing in zoos in those days, where they would let chimpanzees drive like zookeepers around, which is a very dangerous activity. And not one, I don't think that would happen today. There'd be lots of health and safety issues. And those guys in the back aren't even wearing seatbelts. So I mean, this collage of images, they left the kilns in the sidecar motorcycle, and the simple pleasure of seeing this little bear and Lewis recording it, and Warnie talking about it as well, and then going back a week to see it on that journey that led Lewis into this relationship with Christ in a very definite and positive way, and then everything changed. This is the letter I read, which is now in Queen's University in Belfast, and this is the letter that sort of inspired the whole sculpture. And this is the little girl that Lewis wrote the letter to in 1961. She's passed away now, but I was able to find this photograph of her. Her father was a chicken farmer, and you can see the chicken houses in the background. And this is Anne, and she was a beautiful person when I met her. And she wrote to Lewis. You'll notice that the envelopes got a different handwriting. So Warnie was writing the addresses on the envelopes, so that Jack would have more time to write the letters. So it basically goes a bit like this. She was concerned that Aslan had given himself up to lay his life down for the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. And she asked her mum why. And her mum said, I don't know, why don't you write to the person who wrote the book? So she wrote to Lewis, as lots of kids did. And this is the letter that was received. Dear Anne, what Aslan... He goes on to explain that, but he in the end talks about the Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, and he talks about this idea of how if Narnia had gone wrong and how God wanted to save it, how would he save it? He would still send his son to save it, but how would he send his son to a land of talking beasts? He would send him as the king of the beasts. And he'd been having strange dreams about lions. And in the Bible, Christ is known as the Lion of Judah. And he does it very gently, and then he does these subheadings which explain the other books in the Chronicles of Narnia. And then he just signs off, all clear, you're C.S. Lewis. And so I was able to trace the little girl. He wasn't a little girl when I found her, but I remember the day I spoke to her on the phone and said, did you write to C.S. Lewis when you were 10 years old? And she said, yes. And I said, I have seen a copy of the letter that he wrote to you. And she said, where did you see that? It hasn't been published. I said, I saw a photocopy in Douglas Gresham's study. And I said, look, can I use this letter as a starting point for the sculpture? I'm not sure how I'm going to use it, but it's something I believe that must be used. And she said, that would be great. That's the best news I've heard all year. She said, I remember the day that it was a Saturday morning when my mum came and knocked my bedroom door and passed the envelope into my hand and said, who do you know in Oxford? Because the stamp, you can't really see it there, but it has the Oxford stamp mark on it. And she opened the letter and read it, and she said that she carried the letter in her pocket for 2 years. That Mr. Lewis helped her find her faith. And she went on to be a teacher in education and a fine Sunday school teacher as well. And she came with the letter to the unveiling of the sculpture. And it was amazing to meet her. She was such a graceful person. So this is this idea of grace, the alphabet of grace, the grace exchange, where Lewis took the time to sit down. It may have taken maybe 10, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes to write that. That changed this life, that impacted this life. And that letter traveled on and changed my life, as an artist, as a sculptor. And that letter is on the back of the sculpture in Belfast. And C.S. Lewis is still speaking and talking through this letter to others, which is a profound concept. This is the sculpture that I did in 1998. And we didn't have money to do this sculpture. My niece donated the first amount, which was from her piggy bank. And she's now 24. She was quite just a little kid then, about maybe 4 or 5. And she gave me £5.50 from her piggy bank. And I went to Belfast City Council to see if they'd be keen to get behind the idea. And they said, yeah, it's a good idea. We could fund 75% of the sculpture costs. What's it going to cost to do this? And then in 1997, 98, that was going to be around £80,000. And that wasn't including the site. And I had, just like a gift from a little kid. And so I went to see the arts officer in the council. And he said, look, we can finance this sculpture from lottery funding. We can do it. We can give you 75% of £80,000 from the lottery. And I said, look, I know you're going to think this is really strange, but I couldn't really accept that money because I know that C.S. Lewis would not like that. He wouldn't like the idea of that, being involved in that process. And the guy looked at me and said, are you serious? I said, yeah, I can't accept it. Is there no other funding I can apply for that's from another, is it funding from another source? He said, there is, but you need to have some funding to help release that grant that we can give. So I left the office thinking this was never going to happen. And then in 2 weeks' time, I got a phone call saying that an anonymous donor wanted to donate £6,500 to start the sculpture fund off. So I went back to the guy in the council and I said, we now have £6,500 and £5.50. And he said, well, where did you get that in 2 weeks? I said, well, it's been donated anonymously. He said, well, why would someone want to do that? I said, because they don't want to be known. He just looked at me and he said, well, have you met the person? I said, well, it's an anonymous donation. I don't know who it is. He said, well, have you seen the money? I said, well, no, I haven't seen it. Well, how do you know it's true? I said, well, I'm believing that the person who told me this, who knows this person, would not lie. He said, okay, well, I want you to go and set a bank, or I want a bank account set up with a member of the council and an independent trustee. And when you bring me a bank statement, C.S. Lewis Sculpture Fund, and show £6,500, £5.50, then we can proceed. And so in another 2 weeks, I had the statement, I went back to him, and I think he just couldn't believe that this has happened in 2 weeks. And then we got money from other sources. I always mention Punjana Tea, who were a tea blending company in Belfast, who gave £2,000. And I've been drinking Punjana Tea since 1998. And I always mention it in every speech. So I'd recommend that you go out and buy Punjana Tea. It may be hard to get it in Wheaton, but if you go online, I'm sure you can get it sent from Belfast. So they give £2,000. The National Electricity Company, who are the power company, they donated £95. I couldn't reject it because we needed every penny. So, and this is true, I haven't paid an electricity bill on time since 1998. I've always waited for that threatening letter that you're going to be taken to court if you do not pay your bill, and then I pay it. So I always make them wait. I mean, they couldn't even like give £100. They give £95. You know, they're a multi-million-pound company. So on the back of the wardrobe, there's a little list of names, and at the top of that list is there's a little dove that represents the guy who gave the £6,500. So this has all changed now, by the way. This is 1998, and nobody really wanted to know about this. The day I was put in place, I think I was telling some people today, a man walked past and said, "Why are you putting up a sculpture to Lewis Carroll?" And I said, it's C.S. Lewis. He says, "What's Lewis Carroll got to do with Belfast?" I said, "No, it's not Lewis Carroll, it's C.S. Lewis." And then a lady walked past and said, "They'll burn that wardrobe in a week. That wardrobe will be burnt." I said, "It's not a wooden wardrobe, it's bronze. I'm telling you, it'll be burnt in a week." So it was the blessed gift of discouragement. The day that was being put in place, it was a very wet, windy November day, and I could feel this tugging at the back of my coat. And I turned around, and there was 3 little kids. And I'll never forget it. They said, is this to do with C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? I said, "Yeah, we love his work. We love his work. Can we be the first ones to sit in the chair?" I said, "Yeah." And these little kids went and sat in the chair. And I've got a photograph. They'll be in their mid-20s now. And I've often thought about trying to put it out there to find them and get them to come back, you know, and visit it again. So the kids had the most sense, you know, and that spoke to me as well, because I thought if they can relate to that, that's great. In the original model I did, which is pretty basic, he was holding a book because we didn't have enough money to do a chair. But then somebody came and sponsored the chair. So that's why the chair is there. I always wanted a chair, but I didn't think we'd be able to afford it. So that's now all changed. This is now called C.S. Lewis Square. I tried to get that changed 20 years ago, but nobody wanted to know. And they've caught on to the importance of Lewis. They have a festival in that part of Belfast, and they've got now 8 other sculptures behind this sculpture. And that's a good thing for that area, and it's a good thing for awareness of Lewis's work. So that landscape's all changed. This is the letter on the back of the wardrobe that Lewis wrote to Anne. You can see that there's different painting here now, and they've put the sign on the wall. And this is the area now. They've got these trees around it. So you can see the sculpture. They wanted to move that sculpture into another area, but I wouldn't allow it. And I actually said to him, you know, if you try to move it, I will take the sculpture away, because I know a university in America who'd be very interested in that sculpture. And threatened them. You know, I had to. That's you know, and they knew I would take it away if they were going to move it. So there's a library you can't see. There's a little library here, and I wanted to stay outside the library because there's still lots of kids going out of the library. So this was a big thing for me, and as a person who believes, as a follower of Christ, it was the first time that the Christian subculture actually recognized me as an artist, because they just didn't really understand why I'd even want to be doing art, or what importance does it have. But that letter in the back of that wardrobe and that sculpture, and those people who donated, who had the vision, have helped, you know, Lewis and his ideas and his philosophy and his saviour reach out to other people. And I found that a very profound thing, that's still working. I wrote to the tourist board at the time to try and get some money and talked about the idea of cultural tourism, but they didn't want to know. And then when The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe came out, Disney came to film at the sculpture for like an extended edition of the DVD, like these extras they put on the end, and they wanted to find out about it, and they did an interview. So that was a big thing. And then the council and the councillors in that area realised that C.S. Lewis actually had a wide impact across the world, that others, were being impacted by his texts, his books. And so now they've embraced it, and they have a good festival there in November time. And it's part of the culture now of that area of Belfast. In fact, it's one of the lead elements in the culture of that part of Belfast. This is a project that did another sculpture project in a very tough area of Belfast, in a place called Twinbrook in West Belfast, which would be a 100% nationalist area. That means it's 100% Catholic, that no Protestants are in that area, that it would be mainly Republican, which is different from a Republican in America. And they wanted to do a sculpture, or to put something in place to remember young lives that have been lost through tragic circumstances, through joyriding, through suicide, through drug addiction, through all kinds of things. There was a suicide rate in that community that was happening on a regular basis. I think in 1 year there was like 32 young people who'd taken their lives in that area. And so I went to see these people, and I'd never been in that part of Belfast because it was dangerous to go there, and they were actually really nice people. And they asked me, what would I do? We want to put a memorial in place. And I said, look, I don't think you should use the word memorial. Let's have something a bit more uplifting. And I said, where's this going to go? And they said, in St. Luke's Parish Church, Catholic Church. And what would you do? And I just automatically thought about the idea of Luke, the physician, of Luke, the outsider, the Gentile, who followed Christ, who recorded those people who were outsiders in Christ's journeys, the widow, the leper, the child. And I said I would do a sculpture of a young physician, of a young St. Luke, as he would be today, coming into this community as a healer. And that all the families who'd lost a life would make a heart, and it would be on his coat. And that would be part of this healing process of this physician going to the great physician. And so all the families I engaged with, and some families wouldn't talk to other families because some had children who were killed in joyriding, some were children who were joyriders who'd been killed. So it was pretty intense at times. But this is a project I did with the primary school kids, and this is what they wanted him to look like. And so that's their idea, and then this is Luke. And this is a close-up. You can see the hearts on the jacket. And this heart up here was it really blew me away. This was a mother who came to me one day and said, look, I would like you to put this on a heart. It's the most precious thing I own, that's part of my daughter's life. And her daughter died on her 18th birthday. And her daughter's boyfriend had stolen the car, and they'd gone, it's called joyriding, I'm not sure if you have it in America, where young people steal cars and they just drive around and wreck them. So she was in this car with her boyfriend. He'd stolen it, and he drove towards an army checkpoint. And there was a young soldier at the checkpoint. He would have been 18 or 19. And they drove through it, and he turned and shot at the car, and he killed the girl, and he killed the driver. And she was wearing this earring the night she was killed, and that was the most precious thing her mother owned. And I couldn't believe that this mum had come to me with this earring in a little box and said, I want you to put that on a heart for me. And that really touched me, And it's the only sculpture I've ever done as well that's been blessed by the parish priest, which is a big thing. And they took it very seriously. They have a ceremony, like a service at this sculpture every year, not to look and worship at the sculpture, but to remember those lives that have been lost. So that was an important cross-community work for me. These are some of the guys from the area I work with. And this was a youth club I went to work with. And this area behind, you see here, is the place where young people would go to commit suicide. It was called the Glen, and it was a river, and it had big trees. The council have cut down all the big trees. Those are just like big hedges. And these are young guys who had friends who had taken their own lives, who went to the local school. And this is called the Hope Stone. And these are all words that they thought up, that if they had to say one thing or a few words to someone who was thinking about taking their own life, to stop them, to give them hope, these are the words they came up with. And it was a very touching project, and they were really proud of it. So it's a community outreach project, and it was really nice working with those guys. So they live in Twinbrook as well, and this is like maybe 12 years after the St. Luke sculpture. So this was still happening, going on. These are some community outreach projects with schools. Notice there are some projects on Lewis and other Irish poets. And these are some other schools and some older guys. These are dock workers, and this is a project to do with celebrating their unions and dock workers. And these guys who are like football supporters who are pretty hardcore vandals, and just like they would start fights at football matches. But once you get to them and they get involved in the creative process, even if it's Wayne Rooney, they become softer, and they like the idea of making things. So all these things are really important to me as an artist, reaching out. This is a project in a little village called Brashean. It's called the Butterfly Man, and we did this with like lots of kids from the village. And it was the idea of change and how important children are in the village and how their heart beats loudest in a way because they're the future of the village. And this is all cut out of stainless steel and painted by the kids. And it casts beautiful shadows on the wall when the sun passes across it. This is a corporate project in the head of the Law Society in Belfast, and it came from that idea. And this is called the Man of Letters, and it's about 50 foot high. And it was a really big logistic thing to get this put in place. I had to hire guys with harnesses to abseil down and put these on the wall. And it's called the Man of Letters. It's the idea of the lawyer's letter, being the form of communication, the way that he would communicate with clients. And that's a shot of the building at night. It's like a 6-story building. This is the sculpture project I did in 2012, which celebrated shipyard workers and the Titanic centenary. And this is in a really in a working class area where a lot of these the people who live there now, their grandfathers would have worked in the shipyard. There's still some people who do work in the shipyard still, and that's on the Newton Ards Road in East Belfast. These are 3 guys that were a big influence on me: Joseph Brodsky, Derek Wolcott, and Seamus Heaney. And they all won the Nobel Prize. Derek Wolcott won it first. Joseph Brodsky won it in 1987, I think, and then Seamus Heaney. And they were all mates. And their hero poet was Robert Frost, because they're all country poets. They wrote about their own place, and Robert Frost was a big influence to them. So these are really amazing quotations by these Nobel laureates. Heaney says poetry is about redemption, about making your soul. And the Wolcott one, I've never separated the writing of poetry from prayer. I've grown up believing it is a vocation, a religious vocation. And Joseph Brodsky, if there is any substitute for love, it is memory. And this is a beautiful quotation from Wolcott, who just died last year. He was a lovely man, beautiful man. And I was commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery in London to go and paint his portrait. And this is the portrait. It's called The Sun Poet. And I wanted it to be really hot and full of heat. And that's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. This was the last project I worked on, Amy Carmichael, who was born in Northern Ireland in a place called Malile, who went to be a missionary in India, in the southern part of India, in a place called Dohnavur. And she helped to rescue children who were being married to temple gods and who were being abused, and they came to her. But this was celebrating her early life in Northern Ireland, and it's a sculpture of her as a 10-year-old, and it's to do with the impact that her mother and father had in her early life. And there's a story about Amy Carmichael that when she was about 10, she prayed that her mother had these beautiful sky blue eyes, and Amy had dark brown eyes, and she prayed to God one night that God would change her brown eyes to blue eyes. And she got up in the morning, her eyes were still brown, and she talks about this idea of no being an answer, that sometimes no is an answer, even though we don't recognize that, and it may not be the answer we want. And later in life, when she went to India, kids were running away from these temples and coming to her, and because she had dark brown eyes, she stained her skin with coffee, and she wore a national dress, and she was able to get into the temples because she looked like an Indian, to see what was happening. And she lobbied the government at the time to stop this practice of marrying usually infant girls off to temple gods to be servants in the temples. And she changed that. She was a social reformer. She wrote over 40 books. She set up a school. She set up a hospital. She set up an orphanage, which is still going today, still running strong. So this is a brilliant quotation from Amy Carmichael. She wrote poetry, which is very beautiful. And that's a really lovely quotation. I know she was very influential on Elizabeth Elliott, who was Elizabeth Elliott a student at Wheaton? Yeah. Elizabeth Elliott's daughter, Valerie, came all the way from North Carolina to the unveiling of the sculpture. Yeah. So this is a sculpture. It's outside a Presbyterian church in Bangor. And there's a YouTube video that explains this, but these are some of the kids I work with in the Sunday school. And we had a special Sunday school where it started at 9 o'clock in the morning. And all the 10-year-olds in the Sunday school came to work in the project because the sculpture of Amy as she was 10. And they did all these different portraits. And there was a little boy called Adam who kept putting his hand up. And he wanted my autograph. And I reluctantly, gave it so he would stop putting his hand up. And the youth pastor picked 4 of these kids to come out to the front of the church. We went into the church that morning for 10 minutes so that they could be aware of what was happening with the kids. And he'd lined up 4 kids to ask questions to, and they'd rehearse the questions. So they get up in front of this massive church. It's one of the biggest Presbyterian churches in Ireland. And Adam just runs up at the last minute and gets in between the 4 of them. And no questions been rehearsed with him. So I know the guy's in fear and trepidation when he comes because he's going to have to say something to Adam. So the 2 kids first are asked these questions and they do these beautiful answers. So he comes to Adam and he says to Adam, would you like to say something? He says, I'd like to make the congregation aware that we are working this morning with a really famous artist. Yeah. I thought it was great. Yeah. So that was in December. It was unveiled on the 16th of December, which was the 150th birthday of Amy Carmichael. And I think we just finished off with this. You would not have called me unless I had been calling you, said the Lion, which is a pretty profound and theological statement from C.S. Lewis. We've got 5 minutes left, and we can have a Q&A time. And if anybody wants to ask any questions, feel free. I have some postcards. If anybody would like to have one of these, they're free, and you're welcome to have one. But I'm not sure if anybody has a question or anything I've said has this. Jerry?
Yeah, you said something. We could do this so we catch it. You said something in conversation last night that I thought was really interesting. You being from Ireland, us trying to understand that side of C.S. Lewis. And I asked you, why is it that small island has produced such great literary figures and Lewis coming out of that milieu? Could you give us the answer you gave? It was really brilliant.
I'll try and remember that answer. Well, I think it's to do with the beauty of the place is the first thing. It has an impact on you. Even the hardest soul, can't help but be impacted by the beauty of the landscape. You can travel anywhere in Ireland within an hour and see a wide range of landscape, especially if you go around the coast. And the northern light that's in that part of Ireland is very atmospheric, and it has an effect on the spirit. And it's this idea of the soul of the eye. And, some people recognize that they're seeing with the soul of the eye. Some people don't get it, but they feel it. And so I think it's an outpouring and a homage towards creation. Whether those poets or writers know that they're paying homage to God, they are, even if they don't recognize it, because of the impact of what he's made. And I think it's just part of the condition there. And there's this whole idea of conversation and talking. People like describing things there and explaining things, and people would just call to other people's houses to hear other people talk. You'd love it, Jerry. I know you like coming to Ireland, and I think I know why now. But conversation is still a big thing, and people will stop and talk to each other and tell each other stories. And so some of that finds its way into the written word. And Seamus Heaney, a great mind, like one of the greatest poets, if not maybe the greatest poet in Ireland, grew up in a very humble place. His father was a cattle dealer, lived in a farm in an obscure country area, and he was inspired by listening to the shipping forecast at night on the radio. That was like poetry to him, because he was able to imagine these places and the gales and the storms and the speed of the winds. So I think a lot of it's to do with that. There's more communication now in Ireland, more stuff happening that can interfere with that interaction, but it's still happening, especially in country areas. People still stop and talk, and will stand and talk to you for hours, if you stand. So it's this idea of communicating and telling a story, and that finds its way into poetry, painting, music, all kinds of things like that. So it's just part of the condition, because, like somebody like Patrick Kavanagh, who was a farmer poet, started writing poems about potatoes, which was not cool at the time. But, led on to inspiring people like Heaney and people like Robert Frost, who was like a country poet, who wrote about simple things in a profound way. And a lot of these people exalt the ordinary. They exalt the ordinary things around them, which is something that people feel to do. So.
Heaney had that one poem where he was watching his father and grandfather digging potato reels. He writes about that. He says, I'll never be able to dig like them. This pen is mine.
Spade. Yeah, he would dig with his pen. He'll dig for words, not potato. Yeah. So there's that element. It's part of the Irish condition, you know, and the Irish-Scots condition, the Ulster-Scots condition. And Scotland's like that as well. You know, I think it's a Celtic thing that's just in the psyche. Yeah.
I'm just curious, you know, because you had talked somewhat about the Catholic and the Protestant aspects there. So Lewis Square, in what part of town is that located in? Was that a political consideration, the location of the statue as well?
It was more a geographical thing, because that was the area that Lewis grew up in East Belfast. His grandfather lived 2 streets away from where that was one of the things that led me there, because his grandfather lived 2 streets away from where that statue was put originally. And the other thing was there was a new library being built there, and I thought he would like that, you know, idea of this trigger, as it were, outside the library, so that when kids were going in and out. There's been a novel written about it, you know, about a little kid who stayed in the library late at night because he came from a difficult family, and you know, he was being put out of the library, would stay until the last minute, and one night he was being put out and he backed into the sculpture, and it explains the whole story of, you know, of Jack and all this sort of stuff. So it wasn't a political thing, it was a geographical thing. And Lewis was born in East Belfast. You know, the shipyard, he could hear the horns and the metal workers at night time. You know, it was like the soundtrack to his childhood, he said. So it's become a really important thing for that part of the city, because moving out of the conflict situation, identity is still a big thing in Belfast. And north, west, south, east have very different identities. And somebody from South Belfast and somebody from North Belfast, it's only maybe a couple of miles. It's completely different. You know, they have their own identities, and some of that's to do with, might have a sectarian element to it. Most of it's geographic, you know. Like where I live near a place called Coleraine, and people in Bush Mills, who are maybe about 10 miles from Coleraine, speak with a Scottish accent. And they're only 13 miles from Scotland. You know, I live 18 miles from Bush Mills. People in Bush Mills live closer to Scotland than do to me. And they speak with a Lowland Scots accent. So there's a lot of geography. And people in Ballymoney who live near Coleraine have a very different accent. So there's, it's just this thing. And Lewis would have been proud of being an Ulsterman, although he spoke with a very like posh accent. You can still get little traces, you know, when you listen to that recording that you can hear him talk about mere Christianity. So it was basically to do with where he grew up, and his grandfather would have walked him down past there because there was a railway crossing there, and he was sort of mildly obsessive about trains. And St. Mark's Church is not very far from the Hollywood Road there. So no, it's just a geographical thing. And that geographical deposit has helped grow the C.S. Lewis Festival and brought along all the other sculptures and like a cafe and all kinds of things. Yeah.
Are you planning to do a sculpture in the United States, like in Wheaton?
I'm not planning to do that, but you know, I'm open to invitations. Doing a sculpture is not the difficult thing. You know, those sculptures it's a very expensive process. And I have to travel to a foundry in Dublin to do the work. Like the Amy Carmichael sculpture had to be raised, you know, through subscription. And a friend of mine started that idea off, and then he became ill and passed away. And I promised I would keep it going, so I had to get 2 big donors towards the end to get that across the line. And that was a gift to the church, that sculpture. You know, the church had nothing to pay towards it. the deal with the church was that they would do the groundworks for the sculpture. And they put about, I would say, £10,000 into that. They embraced that with relish. They couldn't believe it, you know, and they did a brilliant job, organised it really well. I insisted on working with the kids in the church, which they hadn't really thought about, but then realised it was important because it was a sculpture of a kid. And you know, that was a big thing to do that. It's the first sculpture, I think, outside any Presbyterian church in Ireland, you know, which is a radical thing, you know. A sculpture, I think, outside any Reformed church, you know, is a radical thing. So that's a big step forward. And I would like to think it'll be a foot in the door, you know, that others might think about this idea of how to express or openly share the identity of faith in a way that has a quality to it. My fear about these sort of things, personally, you know, even myself, when I'm doing things, is the quality of what's there, you know. I saw a sculpture that David worked on over in the Billy Graham building, which I was blown away with today. I thought it was very profound, and I thought it was an amazing thing. That was in Wheaton College, a sculpture of Christ. And we need more things like that. We need more things like that on this campus, where things are outwardly expressed and not just locked away in minds, you know, but they're shared with others. And that the visual arts, music, all those kind of things help express the identity of the place, you know, help give expression to what's felt, what's seen here and felt here, you know, and we don't do enough of that. Our education system educates young people out of creativity, you know, to more memory-based learning. And it's the creative people who help us, who soothe our souls. If Lewis hadn't have, you know, if we didn't have C.S. Lewis, we'd be very poor, you know, in what he's contributed. I mean, even that letter he sat down and wrote to that little kid, that grace exchange, that idea of being able to share the grace that he was given with a child, that impacted her life. She carried the letter in her pocket for 2 years. Mr. Lewis helped me find my faith. I mean, that's unbelievable. And we have a responsibility to that grace and to be legacy bearers of grace, whether that's in the creative arts or in poetry or writing or in mathematics or in engineering. You know, we have to be creative. And a campus like this should have more visual dynamic to it. You know, not that it doesn't have great visual dynamic in the architecture and things, but I mean, it can be more personal, it can have more of an impact, it can tell more of a story, it can reach out. And you have the students here and the staff to think and do those sort of things. And the gymnasium centre over there with the art department I had a tour around today, is unbelievable. And I just kept on saying to the students last night, you need to realise, you know, how well off you are, because someday you look back and think, wow, you know, that was amazing, you know. So the seeds are there, and we have to grow them. You know, we have to encourage them. Encouragement is oxygen to the soul, and we need to be encouragers and to give courage to others. That's about it.